What would you do if someone called 911 to remove you from your own porch? I came back to my lakeside cabin looking for peace, then a HOA. Karen called 911 to remove me from my own porch. The more I pushed back, the more I uncovered the secret they were desperate to hide. And when I found the map buried beneath my cabin, I realized the truth was far crazier than anything they expected. The morning air over Coal Lake had that crisp bite you only feel in early spring, the kind that wakes you up before the coffee does. I had returned to my old family cabin the night before, hoping a few quiet days in the mountains might settle the exhaustion I'd been carrying for years. The place sat at the edge of the water like it always had. Weathered logs, tin roof, a porch that creaked at the wrong times, but still felt more like home than anywhere I'd lived in the city. I stepped outside with a mug in one hand and a plate in the other, the smell of peppered steak drifting into the cool breeze. The sun was just climbing past the ridge, painting the lake in long ribbons of gold and pale blue. That was when I noticed the caution tape. Bright yellow strips fluttered around my porch posts, wrapped sloppily as if someone had been in a hurry. They pulled tight and hummed in the wind. At first I thought maybe there'd been a bear sighting or a safety notice put up by the county. But the tape didn't look official. It looked theatrical, deliberate, almost spiteful. I tore one piece loose and shook my head. My name, Remy Cole, was still etched into the deed framed inside the cabin. No one had the right to tape off my property like this. I sat down anyway, easing into the old wooden chair that had belonged to my father. The dog settled at my feet, stretching out across the boards warmed by the first light of day. I cut a slice of steak, letting the quiet fill the space around me. The lake was calm, flat as polished glass, reflecting the tall pines standing guard on the far bank. If peace had a sound, it was the gentle lap of water against the posts beneath my feet. Then a car engine shattered the stillness. I heard it long before I saw it. The aggressive grind of tires on gravel. The kind of driving that told you something unpleasant was heading your way. Dust rose between the trees, swirling in the sunlight, as a white SUV barreled toward my cabin. It fishtailed slightly at the last turn, then came to a hard, angry stop 30 feet from my porch. The door flew open, and out stepped a woman dressed in sharp pink and red, as if she were late for a board meeting instead of trespassing on a lakeside property at sunrise. She marched toward me with the determination of someone who'd already decided she was right. Blonde bob haircut, expensive earrings, and an expression that could curdle milk. "You!" she shouted, before she'd even reached the bottom of my steps. "You're trespassing on community property. Get off that porch immediately." I blinked at her, unsure whether I'd misheard. "Ma'am," I said calmly, setting my fork down, "this is my cabin, my porch, my property. You're standing on my land." She jabbed a finger toward the lake behind me. "This entire shoreline is under the jurisdiction of the Silver Ridge HOA, and you, whoever you are in violation of multiple community codes." I stood slowly, brushing crumbs from my shirt. "My name is Remy Cole, and this cabin has been in my family for nearly 70 years. I'm not in violation of anything." Her face reddened with a kind of offended disbelief. "I'm Bethany Reed, HOA president, and I'm telling you to leave immediately. You do not have permission to sit here, fish here, or occupy this deck." I let out a short, confused laugh. "I don't need permission to be on my own porch." That was the moment she snapped. In one dramatic motion, she pulled out her phone and lifted it high like she wanted the whole mountain to witness what she was about to do. "Fine," she snapped. "Since you refuse to comply, I'm calling the sheriff. You're trespassing on a protected community amenity." I stared at her. "Ma'am, this is my home." She ignored me completely, already barking into the phone. "Yes, dispatch. There's a man refusing to leave restricted HOA property. Send someone immediately. He is a threat to community safety." I almost dropped my coffee. A threat? I hadn't done anything but try to enjoy breakfast. Minutes later, gravel crunched again. A sheriff's truck rolled up the hill, sunlight flashing across the windshield. Sheriff Jake Mercer stepped out, tall and steady, hat pushed back slightly, as if he were bracing for something foolish. He took one look at Bethany, then at me standing on my porch, and exhaled slowly through his nose. "Morning, Remy," he said, voice carrying a hint of concern. "Mind telling me what this is about?" Before I could open my mouth, Bethany launched into her speech. "Officer, arrest him. He's violating HOA boundaries, harassing the neighborhood, and refusing to leave restricted property." Jake looked at her, then back at me, then at the porch beneath my boots. "Ma'am, this is his property. His deed is on file with the county." Bethany's eyes widened, like she'd just been told gravity was optional. No, that's incorrect. The shoreline is HOA jurisdiction, and he has no right to access it. This is community property." Jake rubbed his forehead. "Ma'am, this is a private cabin on a private lot. Remy's not trespassing on anything." The wind carried a long silence between the three of us. The lake shimmered behind me. The pines rustled like they were holding in a laugh. Bethany's expression hardened into something cold, almost calculating. She lowered her phone but didn't step back. Something in her eyes told me this wasn't just about my porch. Something much bigger was brewing beneath the surface. Sheriff Jake gave her a polite nod, the same one he used when dealing with tourists who thought they knew more about wilderness survival than the locals. "Ma'am," he said, "I'll file a log of your call, but there's no crime here." He tipped his hat toward me. "Remy, try not to let this ruin your morning." I offered a half smile, though irritation was already tightening in my chest. Jake climbed back into his truck, the engine humming as it rolled away, leaving Bethany standing at the bottom of my steps like an unwanted statue. She watched the sheriff's taillights disappear down the gravel road, then slowly turned her attention back to me. "You think this is over?" she said, barely above a whisper, but somehow sharper than her shouts. "You have no idea what you've stepped into." I sighed, setting my empty coffee mug aside. "Ma'am, all I stepped into was my own porch. You're the one trespassing." Her lips curled. "We'll see about that." She spun on her heel and marched toward her SUV, the gravel spitting under her pumps as she drove away in a plume of dust. For a moment, the world felt quiet again. Too quiet. Even the dog seemed uneasy, lifting his head and sniffing the air as if sensing trouble still lingering. I shrugged it off, returned to my chair, and tried to finish breakfast. But something tugged at the back of my mind. Something about the way Bethany had spoken, the confidence in her voice, the certainty that she had authority over land that clearly wasn't hers. By noon, I had my answer. When I opened the cabin door to grab tools from my shed, I found a bright orange paper taped across the wood. Notice of violation, $50,000 fine, unauthorized use of community property. I froze. The date was today. The signature, Bethany Reed. The reason? Illegal occupation and interference with HOA amenities. I tore it down, scanned it twice, then a third time. Not a single reference to county law. Not one legal citation. Just a bold, official-looking stamp that probably came from an office supply store. Before I could even react, another SUV pulled up. The same private security group I'd seen patrolling the new lakefront development last fall. Two men stepped out, dressed in matching dark jackets with Silver Ridge Protective Services stitched on the chest. They didn't look threatening, but they stood like men who wanted to be. One of them raised a hand in a lazy half-wave. "Afternoon, sir," he said. "We've been instructed by the HOA to secure this access point." I stared at him. "This is my driveway." "According to the HOA, sir, it is a shared private road leading to community amenities. Only authorized residents may use it. I pointed at the cabin. Authorized. That's my home. The man shrugged in a way that suggested he'd shrugged at a lot of angry homeowners. Just doing our job. He then placed a small barricade, bright red and white, across the lower part of the drive. My dog barked at the clatter, tail stiff, fur bristling. I felt a knot winding inside me, a slow, tightening coil of frustration. Your job is blocking me from my own property? I asked. No, sir. Our job is enforcing HOA directives. The second man added, If you need exceptions, speak with Ms. Reed. I held back a laugh. Yeah, that'll go well. They left without further word, their boots crunching on gravel like punctuation marks. I turned around, surveying what had been done in a few short hours. Caution tape still fluttering around my porch posts, a barricade at the drive, a violation notice on my door. The place looked less like a family cabin and more like a crime scene from a show where no one bothered to check the facts. Not long after, neighbors began drifting by, some walking dogs, others pretending to jog past. They threw quick glances at the barricade, then at me, then at the violation notice crumpled in my hand. One man slowed enough to mutter, Tough luck, buddy. Shouldn't have picked a fight with the HOA president. I didn't pick anything, I said, but he was already hurrying away. By sunset, the whispers had grown louder. I caught phrases floating across the water from the new Lakeside homes. He's ruining the neighborhood. He's blocking lake access. He shouldn't even be there. Bethany said the cabin sits on HOA land. It was surreal. I'd been home less than 24 hours, and somehow, without lifting a finger, I was now the villain of Silver Ridge. But the final straw came just as twilight settled over the lake. Another notice appeared. This one slipped under my door. Seizure order. Temporary transfer of shoreline control to HOA authority. Signed by Judge Harold Benson. Except Judge Benson was an old friend of my father, a man who'd eaten dinner in this very cabin more times than I could count. And I knew something Bethany apparently didn't. Benson had retired 4 years ago after a stroke. He wasn't signing anything, not even birthday cards. My irritation turned to something sharper, something colder. Forged signatures, fake security, bogus fines, and a president acting like she owned the entire valley. Why? I stepped out onto the porch, listening to the evening settle around me. The lake shifted from gold to deep blue. Frogs began their chorus near the reeds. The mountains absorbed the last of the light. Something was wrong. So wrong it made the hairs on my arms stand up. Bethany wasn't just bluffing or overstepping. There was intent behind all of this, a plan, a motive, and whatever she was hiding, she needed me gone before I figured it out. Night fell slow over Coal Lake, the kind of slow that presses on your chest and reminds you how small you really are in the middle of the Montana wilderness. I stayed on the porch long after the sun dipped behind the ridge, listening to the distant hum of crickets and the faint trickle of water slipping along the rocks near the dam. The cabin, old as it was, had a way of settling into the evening with soft groans, timbers shifting, rafters easing, the faint aroma of dried pine seeping through the walls. It felt alive, almost aware. That was the first moment I sensed the house was keeping something from me. I stepped inside, lit a lantern, and sat at the worn wooden table. The fake seizure order sat in front of me, the signature glaring up like a joke told with a straight face. I traced the ink with a thumb, trying to understand how far Bethany was willing to go to force me out. HOA politics were wild everywhere. But forgery? Putting up barricades? Manufacturing fines? That wasn't HOA-level chaos. That was desperation. The dog padded across the room and pawed at a loose floorboard near the stove. He scratched again, whining softly. I walked over and knelt beside him. The board had always been uneven, but tonight it tilted more than usual, almost as if something underneath had shifted. "Easy, boy," I whispered, easing the lantern closer. I pried the board up, expecting maybe a mouse nest or a warped beam. What I found instead was a small metal box tucked neatly between the joists, the lid dusted with decades of silence. I lifted it carefully. The metal was cold against my palms, colder than it should have been for sitting over insulated ground. When I cracked the latch, the hinges squeaked in a way that echoed softly through the cabin, like the box hadn't been opened in half a lifetime. Inside were folded papers, yellowed with age, and a leather-bound notebook, cracked down the spine. The smell of old ink rose like something sacred. I unfolded the first paper, an old survey chart drawn in faded pencil. The outlines were unmistakable. The shape of Coal Lake, the curve of the shoreline, the ridge behind my cabin. But the boundaries, they extended far beyond what I remembered from county maps. A second chart showed water channels feeding into the dam, channels I'd studied as a kid but hadn't seen documented in almost 50 years. The notebook contained letters. One stood out immediately. Elias Cole, 1947. My grandfather. His handwriting was unmistakable, neat, slanted, disciplined the way men wrote when ink was expensive and every word mattered. My eyes skimmed the first lines. If someone finds this, it means the lake is no longer respected. The land will always speak the truth, even when people forget. Water rights must remain with the Cole name. The grant cannot be broken, not by politics, nor by profit. I sat slowly against the edge of the table, lantern light flickering against the words. Elias died long before I understood what he'd done for this region, before I knew what it meant to manage a dam, to monitor water flow, to study the language of rivers and soil. But reading his words, it felt like he was sitting beside me again, the way he used to when he taught me how to cast a line or measure the depth of thawing ice. I read on. He'd attached notations, legal codes referencing a federal land grant from the early 1900s. Something about uninterrupted water stewardship, title retention, and familial transfer. But the key line, the one that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, was written in thick, deliberate graphite. The shoreline is not to be sold, it is entrusted. Entrusted. A word that held weight, responsibility, legacy. And suddenly, the forged notice, the barricade, the panic in Bethany's voice, it all snapped into focus. She wasn't just trying to bully me. She was afraid. Afraid of something she thought I might know, something that threatened everything she'd been building. I folded the documents carefully and placed them back in the box. Then I grabbed my jacket and keys. If this was real, if the old grant still meant something, there was only one person in the county who could confirm it. Sarah Dunn. She worked late at the county building, especially during budget season. A small-town clerk with a sharp mind, she'd grown up hearing stories about the Cole ranch lands. And unlike most people in the new development, she respected the old families who'd lived here before the lake became an accessory in real estate brochures. I drove down the winding road into town, the truck headlights cutting long sweeps through the trees. When I reached the county building, her office light was still on. Third window from the left, glowing warm against the cold night. She looked up when I pushed the door open, eyebrows lifting. "Remy, it's 12:30. What on earth?" I set the box on her desk. She opened the lid, fingers brushing lightly over the papers. When she unfolded the survey chart, color drained from her face. "Where did you find this?" "Under my cabin floorboards." She swallowed hard, studying the thick pencil strokes marking water boundaries. "Remy, these are federal annotations, old ones, from before the modern subdivisions, before the rezoning, before the developers." "And the grant?" I asked quietly. She reached for her glasses, slipping them on. Her voice softened, almost reverent. If these documents are genuine, your family wasn't just leasing shoreline access. They were the legal stewards of the entire watershed. The lake, the dam, the runoff channels. My heartbeat thumped slow and heavy. So Bethany, she might be trying to seize land she has no legal claim to, Sarah finished. And if this grant still stands, I leaned forward, breath tight. She looked up at me, eyes wide. You may own far more than just your cabin. The words hung between us like dust in a sunbeam, still, suspended, waiting to settle. The old county office creaked around us, a tired building that had seen a century of timber workers, ranchers, and watermen pass through its doors. The fluorescent light above Sarah's desk flickered softly, as if even it understood the weight of what she'd just said. I sat back slowly, letting the thought take shape. Owning more than the cabin sounded impossible. The waterline, the dam, the ridges that framed the lake? No. The county hadn't mentioned anything when I transferred the cabin title. The realtor hadn't said a word. Surely someone would have known if my family still held claim over the basin. Sarah, I said carefully, are you sure this isn't just old paperwork? Something that got replaced over the years? That's what we need to find out, she answered, pushing her chair back and standing. If the grant was ever subdivided or dissolved, it'll be recorded somewhere. Every change in land status leaves a paper trail. She crossed the room, heels tapping lightly on the polished wood floor, and unlocked a wide metal filing cabinet that looked like it belonged in a museum. The drawer groaned open, releasing a cool draft of paper-scented air. She pulled out folders, maps, thin envelopes stamped with dates from 3, 5, 7 decades ago. We worked in silence, first in the main filing room, then in the back archive, where the air was colder and time felt slower. The cabinets clanked as we opened and closed them, the sound echoing through the empty hall like footsteps down an old mine shaft. Dust floated in the lantern glow as we flipped through survey documents, deed transfers, water permits, and environmental assessments. Nothing mentioned the grant. Nothing referenced a subdivision. Nothing confirmed what the papers in my cabin suggested. The more we searched, the more my hope thinned. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the old charts were just historical relics, pieces of family pride without legal standing. By 2 a.m, I felt the exhaustion of the day settle deep behind my eyes. Let's call it, I murmured. We've looked through half the county's history. But Sarah didn't stop. Something in her expression had shifted, a determination sharp enough to cut through the fatigue. Give me another 5 minutes, she whispered, opening one last drawer. It was the drawer no one uses, the kind that sticks from disuse, the metal edges catching and scraping. She tugged hard until it jerked open, revealing a row of mismatched folders with crooked tabs and faded ink. She scanned them one by one. Rezoning proposal, abandoned project, waterline reroute, floodplain survey. Then her fingers froze. This one. Remy, look at this. She slid a dusty black binder onto the desk. The cover bore a dull imprint barely visible under grime. Coal, Water, and Land Grant. Active file. The air felt thinner. The room smaller. My pulse louder. Active file. Sarah wiped the dust with her sleeve and opened it slowly, as though it might crumble if she handled it too quickly. Inside were crisp pages, far newer than the 1940s notebook I'd found at the cabin. These weren't family documents. These were county records, updated, reviewed, filed. The first page carried bold lettering, legal description of federally recognized water and land stewardship, Cole family title. My breath caught. The words felt unreal, like reading a story meant for someone else. Sarah scanned the text, her eyes flicking rapidly across each paragraph. Remy, this file was reviewed in 1983, again in 1997, then acknowledged, though not modified, in 2006. What does that mean? I asked. It means, she said, voice trembling slightly, that the grant was never subdivided, never dissolved. The county never broke it apart. They simply built around it. I stared at her. So, it's still valid? She nodded slowly, lips parting in disbelief. Legally? Yes. Until the grant is officially closed, transferred, or revoked under Federal Water Authority, the land and water rights remain with the original title holder, my grandfather, and his descendants, she said, which includes you. The walls of the archive room seemed to sway for a moment, as if trying to make room for the revelation. The lake, the old dam, the watershed feeding the valley, it all pointed back to my family, to me. Land the HOA claimed control over. Land Bethany insisted was hers to govern, to fence, to fine. How did nobody know this? I whispered. Why didn't the county tell me when I bought the cabin? Because the cabin's deed is separate, she said softly. The water grant isn't attached to the structure. It's attached to lineage. I rubbed a hand across my face. So all those fines, the barricade, the seizure order, so all invalid, she said. And worse, the people who put them there did it without jurisdiction. A spark lit inside me, something like anger, but cleaner, sharper. It wasn't rage for its own sake. It was the kind of anger that forms the backbone of justice. Sarah flipped to another page, brow furrowing. There's more. The grant includes a map of the extended basin. She turned the binder, showing me the outline. This isn't just your shoreline, Remy. This includes the entire perimeter of Coal Lake, the access roads, and even parts of the new Silver Ridge development. I felt my chest tighten, slow, heavy, a pressure that came not from fear, but from understanding the magnitude of what lay in front of me. Bethany hadn't been trying to push me off my porch. She had been trying to keep her empire standing on land she never owned. And if this file was what it appeared to be, she was already standing on borrowed time. I left the county office just as dawn began pressing pale blue across the horizon. The mountains were quiet, still wrapped in a thin blanket of night. My truck rumbled through the empty streets of our small town, tires humming against cracked asphalt as the sky slowly brightened. The binder lay on the passenger seat, its weight feeling heavier than paper should allow. Every bump in the road seemed to remind me of its presence. By the time I reached the forest road leading up to my cabin, the sun had climbed enough to burn the frost off the needles of the pines. Birds cried out somewhere above the canopy. For a brief moment, everything looked the way it always had, wild, untouched, steady. Then I heard the machinery. It was faint at first, a pulsing tremor carried on the wind. But as I got closer, it grew louder, metal grinding, engines revving, something tearing into earth that didn't belong to them. My stomach tightened. The dog perked up in the passenger seat, ears stiff. When the trees opened and my cabin came into view, I felt the shock hit like a shove. 3 contractor trucks were parked by the lake with hazard lights flashing. A bulldozer idled near the shoreline, blade lowered and biting into a patch of native reeds that had stood there for generations. Workers in reflective vests hammered stakes into the ground, pulling bright orange fencing across the waterline. A laminated sign hung loosely from one of the posts. Future site of Silver Ridge Private Lakeside Plaza, HOA Development Project. Authorized access only. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I stepped out of the truck and approached, boots crunching across gravel. The nearest worker barely glanced at me before lifting a clipboard. Sorry, sir, this area's closed today. HOA's orders. This is my property, I said evenly. Who gave you permission to dig up the shoreline? He pointed at the sign. This whole area is HOA jurisdiction. We were told the owner of that cabin was in violation and would be removed shortly. I forced a breath through my nose. And who told you that? Ms. Reed. He flipped his clipboard toward me. Everything's authorized. I skimmed the document. It wasn't real authorization. It wasn't even close. The page had a Silver Ridge HOA logo on the top and a series of vague project descriptions. No county stamp, no environmental clearance, no contractor permits. And the signature? Bethany's, again. She really had made her own little kingdom. Behind us, the bulldozer roared back to life, its blade pushing into soil that had belonged to my family long before Silver Ridge existed. The lake rippled in protest. A cold wind swept in from the north, carrying the smell of churned earth and diesel. I stepped between the bulldozer and the waterline, raising a hand. "Shut it down," I said to the operator. He shook his head. "Sir, if I don't keep working, I lose today's pay." "It's illegal work," I said, louder now. "On land the HOA doesn't own." The man inside hesitated, looking toward his supervisor. The supervisor, a tall man with a trimmed beard, walked over with a forced politeness. "Look, we're not here to cause trouble. We're under contract. And we were told everything's cleared. If there's a dispute, take it up with them, but we're working." I opened my truck door and held up the binder. "Then you might want to read about who actually owns the shoreline." He didn't reach for it. Instead, he waved his workers to continue. The bulldozer lumbered forward again. I stepped back as loose dirt scattered across the lake's edge. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was an attack. A strategic move to show dominance before any legal challenge could surface. If Bethany could reshape the land, physically alter it, she could create the illusion of control. People believe what they see, not what's written in old files. A sheriff's cruiser rolled up the drive. Jake stepped out, adjusting his belt and giving me a tired, apologetic look. "Got another call today," he said. "HOA reported you were interfering with the community improvement project." I held up the binder. "Jake, this is a federal water grant. My family never lost rights to the lake. I have the original surveys. This entire project is unauthorized." He looked from me to the bulldozer pushing a mound of soil. I knew something felt off. Bethany wouldn't show me her paperwork when I asked earlier. "Because she doesn't have any," I said. Jake rubbed his jaw. "I can't shut down a crew without a formal injunction. Not on my authority." I understood. The man had a badge, not a magic wand. Jake lowered his voice. "But I can file a report saying the HOA's documentation looks questionable. It'll buy you time. Maybe keep them from bulldozing the whole shoreline before the county steps in." I nodded. "I'll take whatever time I can get." As Jake spoke with the supervisor, I climbed onto a small rise overlooking the lake. The wind carried the hum of machinery across the water. Ripples spread outward from every strike of the bulldozer's blade, disturbing the stillness my grandfather once protected with meticulous care. I opened the binder again. The map spread across my hands like a long-buried truth coming up for air. It outlined more than shoreline. It outlined a responsibility, one the HOA didn't understand, and one I hadn't known I inherited. The workers continued their tasks. The fencing rose higher. The orange mesh rattled in the wind like a warning. Bethany was moving fast, too fast, like someone who knew her window was closing. She was betting millions on this development, on rights she didn't have, on land she couldn't claim. And if she was willing to forge signatures and fake authority, there was no telling how far she'd go to keep the truth buried. By late afternoon, the bulldozers had quieted. Their engines clicked as they cooled beside the orange fencing, the shoreline torn in long, raw streaks that reminded me of claw marks. The lake reflected the damage with an uneasy shimmer, ripples twisting the sky's reflection into something distorted. The workers packed up slowly, leaving deep tracks in the mud as they climbed into their trucks and drove away one by one. When the last engine faded into the distance, the world grew strangely still. Still in a way that made the hairs rise on my arms. Still in a way that felt like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. I walked the length of the shoreline in silence, boots sinking into the softened earth where reeds had stood hours before. The wind carried the metallic scent of diesel and freshly exposed soil. The dog trotted beside me, nose low, ears forward, uneasy but loyal as ever. I knelt and ran my hand through the damp dirt. It clung to my fingers the way a memory clings to a man who's been away too long. My grandfather would have hated seeing the shore carved up like this. Inside the cabin, the old lantern flickered against the log walls, making the place feel smaller and older than usual. I set the binder and the tin box on the kitchen table. The documents lay open like a set of forgotten instructions written for a future no one expected to arrive. I pulled a chair closer, exhaled deeply, and began organizing everything. Deeds, survey overlays, grant language, boundary descriptions, environmental notes written in Elias's precise hand. Each piece told a fragment of a story that had been waiting decades to be understood. A story about stewardship rather than ownership, about duty rather than privilege. As I pieced the timeline together, the dog curled beneath the table, his slow breathing grounding me. Outside, the northern wind swept along the lake, rattling the windows and tapping at the cabin walls like an old friend asking to come in. I paused, letting my thoughts drift. Years ago, before I walked away from dam engineering, I'd spent countless nights studying water flow, sediment drift, and the quiet conversations between land and lake. Those diagrams and charts taught me something I'd forgotten until now. Water doesn't lie. Land doesn't lie. People do, and Bethany Reed had lied a lot. The realization settled over me like a weighted blanket. I understood now why she had stormed onto my porch, why she had fabricated seizure orders, why she'd surrounded herself with security guards, cameras, and whispered rumors. She wasn't trying to enforce rules. She was trying to protect a fragile illusion she'd built on top of stolen authority. I took a breath and began assembling a master file, the kind of file a federal auditor would draft, neat and devastating. I added timestamps of every violation notice, every forged document, every unreasonable restriction placed on my property. I clipped in the audio recording from Sarah, confirming the existence of the grant. I included photos of the bulldozed shoreline, taken moments earlier. The case was forming, not a weapon, but a truth. And truth, handled correctly, is sharper than any blade. Hours passed. The lantern burned low. A soft layer of frost began creeping onto the edges of the window glass. The mountains outside turned silver beneath the moonlight, each ridge outlined in a pale glow. I stood and walked outside, letting the cold night air clear my head. The dam's silhouette loomed at the far end of the lake, a dark, angular shape against the sky. I crossed the rocky path leading to it. Each step echoed, the sound bouncing softly across the water. Halfway across the catwalk, I stopped and leaned against the railing. The lake spread beneath me like a sheet of obsidian, calm and reflective. The stars shimmered across its surface, broken only by the slow, steady pulse of the water spilling somewhere beneath the old concrete lip of the dam. I closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my old profession settle back into my bones, not as a burden, but as purpose. I understood dams, land surveys, water rights. I understood the law that governed them, the agencies that oversaw them, the way grants had to be executed and recorded. Suddenly, everything aligned. All the forged documents, all the rushed development projects, all the misdirection. Bethany wasn't just overstepping. She was racing against time, racing to anchor her false claim in physical changes before any legal challenge could surface. A man can claim ownership over water only if the water isn't already spoken for. And this water had been spoken for long before the HOA even existed. The wind shifted, cold and sharp, tugging at my jacket and carrying a low howl across the basin. It sounded like the lake itself reminding me, do not let them take what was entrusted to your family. When I returned to the cabin, the lantern finally gave out with a soft pop. Darkness filled the room for a brief, quiet moment. Then I lit another and continued working. Line by line, page by page, the truth formed into a document that would unravel everything Bethany had built. By the time I closed the binder, the first pale light of dawn was edging across the lake. The dog stretched beneath the table, shaking off sleep. I placed a hand on his head. It's almost time, I murmured. Tonight had been the silence before the storm. Tomorrow, the storm would come. It arrived sooner than I thought. Around mid-morning, a thick packet was taped to my cabin door with heavy strips of packing tape, as if someone believed I might tear it down and run. The headline glared at me in bold, overconfident lettering. Emergency HOA Assembly. Mandatory attendance. Vote on immediate removal of non-compliant resident. There was no name written, but it didn't need one. Everyone knew exactly who the non-compliant resident was. The meeting was scheduled for that evening at the Silver Ridge Community Lodge, one of the newer buildings along the lake, all polished beams and over-treated lumber. A place built to impress homebuyers who liked the idea of rustic living without the inconvenience of actual rustic living. I arrived just before sunset. A row of SUVs lined the gravel lot. Porch lights glowed warm against the wood, casting long shadows across the deck. Voices murmured inside, tense and impatient. My boots thudded against the boards as I stepped up to the entrance. Conversations softened the moment I pushed open the door. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Bethany stood at the front, wearing a blazer so bright it almost reflected the overhead lights. She hovered near a projector screen filled with slides, photos of the shoreline, some heavily edited, others taken without context. She smiled tightly, the kind of smile that had no warmth behind it. "Well," she said, "look who finally decided to join us." I nodded politely and took a seat near the back. My binder rested on my lap like a patient animal waiting to be unleashed. "Let's proceed," she announced, clicking to the next slide. The presentation began with dramatic flair, zoomed-in shots of me on my porch, me walking my dog near the water, me carrying tools near the dock. Cropped, overexposed, manipulated. Each image was paired with captions like unauthorized lake access and environmental damage in progress. A few residents gasped in exaggerated sympathy. Others watched with narrowed eyes, trying to understand why a grown woman was acting like she'd uncovered a criminal empire rather than a man enjoying breakfast outside. Still, Bethany pressed on, layering accusation after accusation until the air in the lodge grew heavy with tension. When she revealed a graph showing projected loss in property values due to non-compliant activities, I almost laughed. The lines on the chart didn't even match the labels. It was chaos masquerading as data. Then came the final slide, a scanned signature. Judge Benson's name typed neatly underneath. Seizure authorization, shoreline control. I stood. "Judge Benson didn't sign that," I said. Whispers rippled across the room. Bethany's smile faltered, but only for a heartbeat. "Sit down, Mr. Cole," she said sharply. "You'll have your turn." Everyone looked between us like spectators at a tennis match. "No," I replied, raising my voice just enough. "My turn is now." Bethany stiffened. "You are out of order." "And you," I said calmly, "are out of jurisdiction." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that makes even the air listen. I opened my binder. The sound of the metal rings snapping wide echoed through the lodge like the crack of a rifle in open country. I lifted the first document, the same survey chart Elias had drawn decades ago, and held it up. "This," I said, "is the original water and land survey for Coal Lake, drawn by my grandfather. And this," I placed the chart on a nearby table with deliberate care, "is the federal water grant confirming my family's stewardship over the lake, the shoreline, the dam, and the watershed." Bethany barked a laugh. "That's meaningless. Everyone knows the HOA governs the lake." "Do they?" I asked, pulling out the county's active file. I handed it to the nearest resident. He flipped through it, eyes widening, and passed it to someone else. The file made its way across the room. Every face shifted, from confusion to disbelief to a dawning understanding that something enormous was unfolding right in front of them. That was when the twist arrived. Gary Miller, quiet, nervous Gary from 2 cabins over, rose to his feet. His hands trembled as he clutched a crumpled envelope. He looked at me, then at Bethany, then back at the group. "I need to say something," he said, voice cracking. I was paid to speak against Remy." The room erupted in murmurs. Bethany's face drained of color. Gary swallowed hard. Bethany, offered me $5,000 to testify that Remy was harming the lake. I needed the money for Sarah's treatments, but I can't lie anymore. I recorded everything. I brought the recordings." He set the envelope on the table beside my binder. Bethany lunged forward. "That is a lie!" But her voice shook. Her confidence cracked. And the whole room felt it. "What exactly are you running here, Bethany?" someone asked from the crowd. "The HOA is being manipulated," she snapped. "All of you are being manipulated." A heavy knock echoed through the lodge. The door opened. The county attorney stepped inside, a leather folder tucked beneath his arm, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Reed," he said, voice firm, "we need to talk about some discrepancies in your filings." Bethany froze. The room held its breath. Chaos had arrived, and it was only just beginning. He walked farther into the community lodge, boots tapping against the polished floorboards, while 100 eyes followed him. The air in the room shifted, tightening, thickening, turning electric. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the wooden siding and sent a loose porch swing creaking. The place felt less like a lodge and more like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. The attorney set his folder down on the presentation table, directly over the projector controls Bethany had been using. The soft thunk of that leather meeting the wood sounded final, almost ceremonial. "Miss Reed," he said again, "these documents were submitted to the county office as part of your application for shoreline redevelopment. You claimed the HOA controlled this land." Bethany straightened her blazer, chin tilting upward. "Because we do. The HOA bylaws," he raised a hand, "bylaws do not override federal land grants." A murmur rippled through the room. Chairs creaked. People leaned forward. Even the projector light flickered, as if straining to eavesdrop. The attorney opened the folder. Inside lay the very pages Sarah and I had pored over. The Coal, Water, and Land Grant, printed in crisp black ink on county letterhead. The attorney did not simply review it silently. He began to read aloud. "This document hereby recognizes the Coal family as the lawful stewards of the Coal Basin watershed, including but not limited to the dam structure, the adjoining lake waters, shoreline perimeter, natural runoffs, and adjacent easements required for ongoing environmental management." His voice rolled through the lodge with the calm weight of truth. Residents turned toward me, some in confusion, some in apology, a few in awe. Gary sat small in his chair, hands clasped tightly, as if relieved to watch justice peel back the lies. Bethany's face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. She took a step forward. This is ridiculous, outdated, irrelevant. That file must be, the attorney continued reading. This grant remains in effect until officially subdivided or dissolved by joint federal and county review, requiring full family consent. Another murmur, louder this time. A wave of whispers spread across the crowd like wind through dry grass. He lifted his eyes to Bethany. We checked the records. There is no evidence this grant was ever dissolved. No subdivision. No transfer of authority. Nothing. He tapped the folder. It is still valid. Fully. The lodge erupted, not in noise but in stunned silence, the kind that settles deep and heavy, the kind that makes people realize the ground beneath them isn't what they thought it was. I stepped forward only when the attorney nodded for me to join him. I tried telling the sheriff earlier, I said, my voice low but steady. I'm not trespassing on my own land. One woman near the front choked out a laugh, embarrassed, brittle. A man in a flannel shirt removed his hat as though paying respect to the truth. Another whispered, all this time. Bethany's composure cracked. This is a misunderstanding, she insisted. The HOA purchased amenities rights from the developer. We have every legal claim to this shoreline. No, the attorney cut in gently but firmly. You purchased marketing rights, not land rights, not water rights. Nothing in your purchase agreements overrides a federally recognized title. She blinked, hard, as if hoping reality might change if she refused to accept it. The developer, an out-of-state investor with slick shoes and a frustrated glare, stood abruptly. Are you telling me, he snapped, that the one I've been planning my project on, the land she told me was exclusively controlled by the HOA, actually belongs to him? He pointed directly at me. Yes, the attorney replied. Legally, the stewardship of the lake belongs to the Cole lineage. The developer ran a hand through his hair, muttering a string of curses under his breath. None directed at me, all aimed squarely at Bethany. Residents leaned away from her as she sank back a step, feeling the first real cracks in the empire she had built. Her voice rose again, but this time it trembled. This must be fraud. Fabrication. He planted those documents, or bribed someone. Ms. Reed, the attorney said, please don't continue down this road. He reached into his folder again and produced the most damning page yet, a photocopy of Bethany's submission to the county, complete with the forged signature of Judge Benson. We spoke to the judge's family. He has not signed any documents since his stroke. This, he held it up, will require an investigation. That was the moment I knew the tide had turned. Not just a shift, but a full reversal. You could feel it in the lodge, in the collective exhale as the residents realized the truth had been sitting in the county archives for decades while Bethany built her power on sand. A woman in the front row raised her hand hesitantly. So, what happens now? Before the attorney could answer, Sheriff Jake appeared in the doorway, having received the call moments earlier. His hat hung low over his brows, but his eyes were clear, focused. We're reviewing charges, he said. Possible fraud, falsification of county records, unlawful use of authority. Bethany's mouth fell open. And depending on what else turns up, potentially more. Every head turned to her. Every whisper circled back. Her foundation, the one she proudly claimed she built from nothing, was collapsing faster than she could shore it up. The attorney closed the folder gently, almost respectfully. This meeting, he said, is adjourned. The facts will continue from here. Residents rose slowly, their faces carrying expressions of shock, anger, relief, and exhaustion all woven together. The lodge doors opened, letting in the cool, pine-scented evening air. As they filed out, many stopped beside me. A nod, a soft apology, a quiet, "we didn't know." But Bethany, she didn't move. She just stood there, frozen in place, staring at the truth she'd tried so hard to bury. And for the first time, she looked truly afraid. The county attorney gathered his papers, murmuring something to Sheriff Jake before stepping outside into the cooling evening. The lodge emptied in a hush, residents slipping away like people leaving a church after a sermon that cut too close to home. The wooden beams creaked overhead, settling in the silence left behind. Only Bethany, Jake, and I remained. Jake approached her slowly, his boots making soft thuds against the floor. "Ms. Reed," he said, voice steady, "we're going to need you to come in for questioning." She blinked rapidly, as if trying to force the world to return to the way it had been 1 hour ago. "You can't be serious. I'm the HOA president. I've done nothing wrong." Jake sighed, and it was the sigh of a man who'd seen this denial before, from drunk drivers insisting they were sober to old ranchers swearing their gates never broke. "The evidence says otherwise," he said gently. Bethany's breath grew shallow. She reached for the back of a chair, gripping it until her knuckles turned white. "This is a misunderstanding. It has to be. Those files, Cole must have faked them, or bribed the county. Or," I held her gaze, "Bethany, those grants have been in the archives longer than either of us have been alive." She flinched. For a moment, I saw something in her eyes. Not malice, not pride, but desperation. The kind that takes root when someone builds their identity on authority they never truly had. Jake guided her to the door with surprising gentleness. She resisted only a little, stumbling once on the threshold before catching herself. Outside, dusk had deepened into a muted blue, the kind that dims the edges of the world and softens even the sharpest lines. A sheriff's SUV rolled up, headlights cutting through the settling dark. Another deputy stepped out, carrying a set of documents in a sealed envelope and a clipboard. The breeze carried the scent of pine sap and distant wood smoke. In the far distance, frogs had begun their nightly chorus, unaware of the human drama unfolding along the water. "This is unnecessary," Bethany snapped suddenly, turning fiery for a brief final flash. "I'm protecting this community. I built this place. I kept order when no one else did. You people don't appreciate—" Jake cut her off, not unkindly. "Bethany, you forged a judge's signature. You filed fraudulent land claims. You paid residents to testify falsely. Whether you meant well or not, that's still against the law." She went silent, completely silent, as if the truth finally pierced whatever shield she'd built around herself. The deputy read the charges aloud: fraudulent filings, forgery, bribery, willful misrepresentation of jurisdiction, and violation of county development protocols. His voice carried across the empty parking lot, drifting out over the lake where tiny waves caught and scattered the moonlight. Bethany's knees buckled. Jake steadied her. "Let's get you in. The car," he said quietly. Her stare shot toward me, sharp, pleading, furious, defeated, all at once. "This was my legacy," she whispered. "You took it from me." I shook my head. "I didn't take anything. I just showed the truth." She didn't answer. The deputy opened the back door, and with one final look, a look equal parts disbelief and heartbreak, she stepped inside. The door shut with a dull thud. The SUV pulled away, gravel popping beneath its tires, until the sound faded into the hum of the night. I stood alone outside the lodge, feeling the wind shift as the valley exhaled. The shoreline in the distance glowed faintly beneath the half-moon, the damaged earth near the waterline now still and waiting. The dog nudged my hand, sensing the change. The storm had broken. But one more chapter remained. what to do with the authority that now rested squarely on my shoulders. Sarah drove up minutes later, headlights sweeping across the empty lot. She stepped out, her face tired but relieved. "Did they take her?" "Yeah," I said. "It's done." She nodded slowly. I'm glad this came out before she dug the hole deeper. The grant, the land, it all makes sense now. What she did, what she was trying to hide. But Remy, one last thing. You know what this means for you, right? "I do," I answered. "You own the basin, the dam, the shoreline, most of the county land tied to the waterway." I let the truth settle. "I know. Everyone's going to look to you now," she said gently, "to decide what happens next." I gazed across the lake, where the moon floated like a coin on dark glass. The pines whispered softly. The mountains loomed patient and unmoving, as if waiting for the next chapter of the story they'd watched unfold for a century. "I've already started the paperwork," I said quietly. Sarah blinked. "What paperwork?" "For transferring the water rights into a public conservation trust," I replied. "The whole lake, the dam, everything." Her eyes widened, breath-catching. You're giving it away?" "It was never meant to be owned," I said, "only protected." The wind swept through the trees, carrying that truth outward across the water. For the first time since this ordeal began, the valley felt peaceful. Tomorrow, the county would wake to headlines. Tomorrow, residents would learn what really happened. Tomorrow, the lake would belong to everyone again, legally, permanently. Tonight, though, I stood quietly at the water's edge, letting the calm settle around me like a blanket. Bethany's empire had crumbled, but something stronger, something honest, was ready to rise in its place. The next morning arrived soft and slow, sunlight filtering over the ridge in long golden ribbons that touched the lake like a blessing. Mist drifted across the surface, glowing as if the water itself had exhaled a long-held breath. I made coffee on the old stove, its familiar hiss grounding me. The dog circled once, then settled at my feet, head resting on my boot. It was the first truly peaceful morning I'd had since returning to the cabin, and maybe the first in many years. I stepped onto the porch, letting the boards warm beneath me. The caution tape was still tangled around one of the posts, brittle now from the cold night. I peeled it off slowly, letting the plastic fall into a trash bag. Removing it felt symbolic, like lifting the last lie off this land. Around noon, the county trucks began arriving, not to enforce anything, but to repair, pulling the illegal fencing from the shoreline, removing stakes, smoothing the soil where bulldozers had carved ugly scars. A couple of workers paused when they saw me, tipping their hats respectfully. The difference between yesterday and today felt like the difference between foam and clear sky. Later in the afternoon, Sarah drove up in her old Subaru, her face bright with tired relief. She stepped out holding an envelope, thick, stamped, and sealed. "It's official," she said. "The paperwork went through." I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was the confirmation from the county. Coal Lake Conservation Trust. Approved, all rights transferred. Public stewardship recognized. My signature sat at the bottom, beside the county commissioners. I traced the ink with a thumb, feeling something lift inside me, a weight I hadn't realized had been there. "You made the right call," Sarah said quietly. "I know," I replied, "and I think my grandfather would have agreed." She nodded toward the water. "The community's planning a gathering next week, a kind of thank you. You don't have to go, but they want you there." "I'll be there," I said. For the first time in a long while, the idea of being surrounded by people didn't feel exhausting. Over the next few days, news spread across the valley. Some folks called, some stopped by, some simply waved as they passed my road. A few apologized for believing the lies, though I didn't hold it against them. Most people only see what they're shown. Bethany had been an expert at showing only what she wanted them to see. And then, almost a week later, the lake came alive. Families arrived with folding chairs, kids raced along the shoreline, older couples set out picnic blankets beneath the tall pines. Someone started grilling. Someone else set up a little table with homemade pies. Laughter echoed off the water, warm and full. The lodge deck overflowed with neighbors, people who maybe didn't understand the legal complexities, but appreciated the outcome. I walked along the dock, listening to the wood creak underfoot. A boy cast his line into the lake, the bobber landing with a soft plunk. A group of teens splashed at the shallows, daring each other to swim early in the season. This living, breathing place was always meant to be shared. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, painting the sky in amber and deepening shades of pink, Sheriff Jake approached me with 2 paper cups of lemonade. He handed one over. "You did a good thing," he said. "Just followed the truth," I replied. He chuckled. "Most people wouldn't have. Most would have used that power to get even." I looked out across the lake, its surface shimmering like a mirror laid between the mountains. Power doesn't mean much if it's used to hurt people. Besides, this lake was never mine alone. Jake nodded, then hesitated. "You know, Bethany's case is moving fast. County attorney says she may face more charges depending on what turns up in the HOA's financials." I let the thought settle before responding. "I hope she finds clarity, maybe even peace." "You're kinder than most," he said. "Just tired," I answered, with a small smile. As evening deepened, lanterns were hung from low branches, their warm glow scattering across the gathering. Music played softly from a speaker someone had set up. Fireflies blinked in the reeds. The lake reflected it all, turning the whole scene into something almost magical. Sarah joined me on the dock. "You ready for your speech?" she teased. "I didn't prepare one." "You don't need to. Just speak from the heart." I took a breath, stepped forward, and the chatter quieted. Dozens of neighbors turned to face me, their expressions open and hopeful. "I won't talk long," I began. "This land has been part of my family for generations. I didn't know the full extent of that until recently. And honestly, I never expected any of this. But stewardship isn't ownership. A lake doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to the people who love it, protect it, and respect it." Faces softened. Someone murmured in agreement. "So this lake, Coal Lake, isn't mine anymore. It's ours. And I hope it stays that way for generations to come." They applauded, not loudly, but warmly, genuinely. Afterward, I lingered by the shoreline, watching the moon rise slowly over the treetops. The water carried its reflection like a silver path stretching toward the far side of the valley. The dog lay beside me, his head resting on his paws, tail thumping occasionally against the dock. For the first time since returning to the cabin, I felt exactly what I had come here seeking: quiet, belonging, purpose. Justice had been served, not by force, not by fury, but by truth. And the legacy left behind wasn't a victory for me alone. It was a homecoming for an entire community. Sometimes the best revenge is restoring what was meant to be. Sometimes the greatest wealth is the one you give away. And sometimes, just sometimes, the land chooses the right person to stand up for it. If you've ever stood your ground against someone who overstepped, drop a simple yes in the comments. Stories like this remind us that truth doesn't shout. It just waits to be found. And if you enjoy tales of justice, land, and the quiet strength of folks who won't be pushed around, feel free to stick around and subscribe. More stories from the lake and the wide open West are on the way.